Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. Today, we're going to answer your listener questions, and again, it's the month of June of 2025 when this episode is getting posted, and so we're making our way through the questions, and we have some different questions here. Again, sort of the theme you hear us talk about every time is that we have a good variety of questions that were submitted by listeners, and thanks again for your patience for us getting to them. And I think, Justin, this is a bit different take on different types of questions. There's a lot of inheritance-related questions, some things related to overriding royalty interests, capital gains taxes when you sell your mineral rights, things about lithium too. That's definitely been a hot topic, and we have an update on the royalty rate. And we were talking before we hit record about speculating how profitable these lithium projects were going to be and just how much royalty owners stand to profit from it. So that'll be interesting to see once those wells start producing and people start getting paid. But, really a good mix of questions and some questions related to if you have really small interests, what do you do if you're leased? Is it a scam? Is it not? How do you determine whether an offer is valid? And those types of things. So pretty interesting questions this month.
You said it, Matt, and I think these are kind of the common points that a lot of mineral owners deal with when they inherit. There's two things sure in life, death and taxes, and this episode covers both of them. So our first one, Matt, is from Caroline here. Caroline says she's trying to figure out her father's oil and gas leases. Her father passed away a couple of years ago, and she's starting to figure out the investments. She'd contacted the operators, submitted an affidavit to one of the operators, and has tried to start the process of transferring the mineral rights from her father to her brother and herself. She's been trying to do the title research, it sounds like, and is stuck on a certain assignment of oil and gas lease. And she's listened to various episodes and just still not exactly sure what this lease means. For example, does it have rights to all wells on a certain piece of property or only to the well named? What kind of rights does he have? So on and so forth. And Matt, this can get very complicated. This could be a standard lease. It could be an overriding royalty interest created from another lease. But I know when I started out, this was one of the most confusing aspects because you read one document that tells you to read another document that tells you to read another document.
Yeah, it can be very confusing. And there was several emails that Caroline had sent, and we'd email back and forth. And so she did end up sending over a copy of that assignment. So in her situation, just to kind of paraphrase the situation that she was in, so she had an assignment document that lists several oil and gas leases. So it was an overriding royalty interest since it's referring to the leasehold interest. And in that situation, just in general, I'll say if you have overriding royalties or leasehold interests, and that includes non-operated working interests, you have to be aware of and monitor the status of the wells that are holding those leases, because once those wells get plugged and abandoned, those leases will expire and the overriding royalty interest or the non-operated working interest will go away. And that's different than if you own mineral rights in most states, aside from those that have dormant mineral statutes, which is a separate whole other episode. You can search for that on the website, on the Mineral Rights Podcast website. We have an episode on that where you can learn more. But essentially, in the situation that Caroline was faced with, she's trying to transfer these interests from her father. So what happened, kind of typical inheritance is maybe these were sitting out there not generating a lot of income. People forgot about them. It wasn't part of the estate plan, wasn't part of the will, or wasn't part of a trust document, or wasn't owned by the trust. And so what ends up happening is they sort of get left behind, and you have to go and pick up the pieces, either go through probate, or in the case of in Oklahoma, what she did, because they were small enough, the operators were able to accept an affidavit of death and heirship. And this is in Canadian County, Oklahoma. And if you want to learn more about that whole process in Oklahoma in particular, listen to episode 85, where we spoke with attorney Richard Winblad about probate and marketable title and kind of the ins and outs of that, and specifically with Oklahoma. But essentially, she's in pay status now with several of the operators, and she's just trying to pick up the pieces again and clean up everything. And she also wants to know, did he have rights to other wells that were drilled on the properties, but or only to the specific wells named? And so this is a common question, and why it's so important to have copies of all your deeds and assignments. And then, if you have questions about it, to get help from a qualified attorney to help you understand what they mean. And in Caroline's case, I believe it appeared that she had interest in the entire leasehold, so it wasn't just a wellbore only list interest. So one thing you can look at when you're looking at your deed or your assignment, if you want to know, do I have ownership in the underlying mineral rights or the underlying oil and gas lease, or just to this one well? Because oftentimes you'll see reference to wells in like an Exhibit A or something like that to that assignment or that deed. But depending on the language, it may just be a reference. It may say, well, including but not limited to these wells, or it could be in this well and this wellbore only. In that case, you would only have interest in the production from that wellbore and not the underlying minerals. So that's a very important thing to understand, and be able to have your leases and your deeds and get copies of all that will help you decipher that. So, again, this is something that I cover in my Mineral Management Basics course, where I have a checklist of all the documents you need. I show you how to perform a title search to get copies of those documents if you don't have them. And then also go down through the types of all the different types of oil and gas interests, so when you look at your deed or your lease, what it's referring to. So again, be sure to have copies of all that information. It's super important, and really is a prerequisite in order to figure out what you own. So anything to add, Justin?
No, I think you hit it, Matt. Make sure and keep that information. And as you're learning early on, keep everything. You'll learn how to interpret more of it as you go along. But keeping those documents is important. Otherwise, you have to spend time each time the situation comes up to reinvestigate, find the information again, make sense of it. But I think you touched on it great, Matt. One
other last thought is that in this case, like Caroline mentioned, that she went through and filed a affidavit of death and heirship. The one thing with an affidavit of heirship is that it does not establish a marketable title to property. So it's not that you are good to go and you have marketable title. And what I mean by marketable title, it's a very specific legal term. It basically means you're the owner. You own that free and clear. Nobody can contest the ownership of that property. With an affidavit of heirship, I believe it has to be recorded and not contested for 10 years before it does establish ownership in that property. So somebody, another heir to that property could come out of the woodwork theoretically and challenge it. And then, you would, if they were the lawful owner, rightful owner, or rightful heir, then you would, lose that property. So important to get help from an attorney, specifically with transferring ownership if you are in an inheritance situation. So they can help you to navigate that and do the right things.
All right. And speaking of marketable title, Matt, our next one here is from Nancy. And Nancy has sold her interest to a land company, is in the situation of trying to figure out capital gains. She inherited these properties in 1988 when her father passed away, and she's going to need an appraisal according to the accountant. She's hoping not to pay 100% capital gains tax, as we all do, and would like more information on how to approach this. She's trying to gather the info concerning the legal description, which will be very important. But Matt, this is a common place for mineral owners to end up, whether you inherit the mineral rights and retain them, and especially when you're selling them.
Yeah, for sure. And this is something, in order to figure out your capital gains tax liability, you basically subtract the sales price. So you have that, whatever you sold those interest for, and then you subtract from that the basis in the property. In other words, the cost basis, or what the property was worth when you inherited it. In Nancy's case, she inherited these interests in 1988. And so what you would need to do is, if he had not gotten an appraisal in 88 and had that number established, then you would have to hire somebody to perform what's called a retrospective appraisal. In other words, or a look back appraisal. So where they kind of put on the, go in the time machine and go back to 1988 and see what type of property or what type of activity was going on in that area, what was known or knowable at the time in terms of what types of wells might have gotten drilled or what kind of production existed at the time. And so you look at what wells were producing, what wells were permitted, what kind of activity was going on in the area, and putting together a defensible story to place value on that future royalty stream as of 1988. And, in 1988, you have to look back and say, you might have been in the heart of the Permian Basin where there's a ton of horizontal Wolfcamp wells getting drilled. Well, in 1988, you could not assume that was going to be the case within, the next 5 years or so, that they were going to start drilling horizontal Wolfcamp wells and hydraulically fracturing them, because that technology and that combination as it exists today was not something that was common practice or wasn't used at the time. So it would have been more conventional related. And so typically when you're looking back that far in the past, the price or the value of those interests are generally a lot lower than maybe what they are today. Again, because things have changed so much, and maybe the property sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it may not have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars back in the day. But it's a good idea to take a look at it. It's worth even just checking to say, okay, is it worth getting a retrospective appraisal for IRS purposes to understand what my basis was? And then, can I save more in taxes than I'll pay in getting that appraisal performed? And so any appraiser should be able to do that for you. That's something I do for my clients. If somebody is in this boat, before I just say, okay, yeah, here, sign the contract, and they'll go off and do the appraisal. And then it turns out they end up paying more for the appraisal than they saved in taxes. I'll do a quick back of the napkin look at the property, see what type of activity is going on, give a ballpark range of what we think the potential value might be. Ultimately you're not going to know for sure until you do the appraisal, but at that point you can say, okay, is order of magnitude, is this thing going to be worth spending it's not inexpensive to get an appraisal done. So to spend the $10,000, $20,000 to get the appraisal done, depending on the level, how many properties you have, how spread out they are, because it's a significant amount of work that goes into the report, so that if you get audited, that you have a solid ground to stand on and you're not going to end up paying penalties. So, it's something that is worth looking at. In many cases, you can save a lot of money in taxes. And again, any appraiser that does this type of work should be able to give you an approximate value estimate or a screening estimate of whether or not it makes sense to do that. Or unfortunately, in some cases, you just have to report a $0 tax basis and pay the full capital gains tax amount, because it's just going to cost more to get the appraisal done and then the actual tax savings that you'd see, just because the value would not be high enough to merit going forward with that. But yeah, so that's something I would recommend, Nancy, if you're in that boat. We can get that screening done, and then again we'll figure out if it makes sense to move forward.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And, I think it really, in the mineral world, a lot of times comes down to the size of the interest and what it makes sense as far as return on investment, not only when it comes to taxes, but when you're looking at title work and different things. All right, Matt, our next one here is a pretty interesting question, and I think this is going to continue to come up more and more. This is from Anita. So Anita says, I think your action items for mineral owners may have answered a question I have about leases and lithium. Is it only new leases that can take lithium into account, or is there something that can be filed now to preserve oil, gas, and other minerals? And what they're looking to do, Matt, is to preserve the rights to the lithium, so that when this becomes more prominent, that's one of the things we were talking before we hit record. There's a lot of different lease language that revolves around other minerals other than oil and gas when it comes to oil and gas leases. And this has changed over the years, but it really comes down to that lease language.
Yeah, it definitely comes down to the lease language. And then also we're getting some case law that is getting set, and regulations and royalty rates that are getting set at the state level. And so all of that together will dictate, what you have rights to and what you don't. And, thankfully it is looking like the mineral estate is the owner of the lithium brine, or at least in most states. So, they're looking at how to establish that royalty rate. And in a couple of instances, in Arkansas in particular, they just recently established a royalty rate of 2.5% on the production of lithium. We were talking before we hit record, how much is that going to equate in terms of royalty payments for those mineral owners? I'm not quite sure yet. And, how is it going to compare to oil and gas? It's, my thought, just based on that lower royalty rate and the low concentration of the lithium in that brine, I think will end up being much smaller payments relative to oil and gas, but I think it'll just we'll have to see how it all plays out and, see what types of royalty checks people get when that starts getting paid. But, lithium, in your case, Anita, and she gave a little snippet of language in her lease. And one of the things that it mentions is that the granting clause mentions oil, but not limited to distillate and condensate gas, including casing head gas and helium and other constituents, and for laying pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't mention anything about lithium or other minerals. And so, again, this is a case where, getting help from a qualified attorney is really the first step. But, at face value, it looks like you would have, your lease does not include lithium. So that would be something you would have the right, again, depending on how things shake out in Oklahoma, to sign a lease for lithium specifically. It depends on also in your lease if it mentions brine or mentions water and things like that. Those are all important things. And it also ultimately is going to come down to, I think, a case-by-case basis. If you have an existing oil and gas lease, what is the language in that lease? And then, again, what is the case law in that particular state as to who owns what and those types of things. So, but again, I think in general, looks like Mineral Estate is the owner of the lithium and other valuable minerals. And the process in general is going to be that you would be offered a lease for those additional minerals if they go and extract them, or they're planning to do that. And then you would negotiate just like you would an oil and gas lease. There'll be probably a little bit different terms just because of the nature of the product that you're dealing with. But that's generally the process.
You said it, Matt. And I think mineral owners really need to be careful, especially as this is in infancy, as far as filing documents related to this. As case law develops, we're going to learn more about how each state might handle this. But just to go and file an amendment to your deed or to a quitclaim deed I don't know that's an action that I would take unless a qualified attorney specifically said, here's the right way to reserve your minerals. That can be a tricky business. And this is something where you should certainly work with a oil and gas attorney to make sure that if there was to be a new lease opportunity or you wanted to sell the property, that you didn't create a title problem from doing something or taking action as far as recording documents.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, Matt. So our next one here is from Terry. Terry says, I'm a mineral owner who has inherited multiple mineral rights from previous family heirs. Her urgent need is to understand a proposal from an oil production company to remove language in their current inherited lease that would allow an allocation well, even though we already have provisions for pooling wells that are currently producing. And I live in a different state where the oil lease is located in Texas, and local lawyers have been unable to assist with the lease review. She's trying to educate herself on whether allowing the change would be beneficial without the support of lawyers, and wants to know if we have any information on pooling versus allocation, advantages and disadvantages for the mineral owner, and so on and so forth. And Matt, this is a tricky one. I'm sure what Terry is referring to with the lawyers is that these folks probably have some conflicts with the oil and gas operator. That's very common for mineral owners in this area. And this gets complicated, Matt. I know allocation wells are a pretty standard operating procedure these days. What is the advantage or disadvantage for the mineral owner?
Yeah, and it really is a very fact-dependent situation where Terry, what I mean by that is the specifics related to that proposed well will determine whether it's more beneficial to pool those interests as part of a pooled unit and going that route, or to just go the allocation well route and don't agree to pooling. And Texas is very unique. They have the Mineral Pooling Act, but it's not like a forced pooling like you have in many other states like Oklahoma, Wyoming, Colorado, etc. So it's something where it's used, but it's more on a voluntary basis. I don't know of very many cases where they actually have, force pooled mineral owners. Again, it's sort of been the norm in Texas is that they're against pooling, and you want to avoid that at all possible. But I would say it totally depends on the specifics of your situation and the outline of that proposed unit, and whether or not by pooling you would have a higher decimal interest in those wells versus going the allocation well route. And it would end up, basically an allocation well might be more beneficial to you if the productive lateral is going through your property, more so than some of the other tracts. So if you have a particular mineral tract that you would get a higher net revenue interest in those wells because the longer section of that productive lateral length going under your property, relative to the overall length of that horizontal length of that well, that could be more beneficial. But the thing is, too, that it could also be on a flip side, right? So if they're drilling 8 wells in the section, and depending on the orientation of those wells and where your tract is, maybe you're going to have a really high decimal in a few of those wells because the lateral goes through a significant portion of your property. But then maybe the other 6 wells, only a very small portion goes through, so you'll have a very small interest in it. Whereas if it was pooled and you had your proportional share of that entire unit, you might actually get more. So really, the only way to look at it is on a case-by-case basis and to see, based on what they're proposing, is the decimal interest in those wells going to be higher or lower based on if you pooled versus going with the allocation well. And we actually have a webinar on this where Jimmy Wright and I talk about this in a lot more detail and give some specific examples so you can see visually, what that would look like. And if you are a member of the National Association of Royalty Owners, or NARO, you'll find that recording of that webinar that we did under the members section. And if you aren't a member of NARO, you can join as an introductory membership. So that's a first-time membership for only $50. So that's $25 off. We'll put a link in the show notes where you can find the coupon code for that. It's MR Podcast. So if you enter MR Podcast at checkout for an introductory membership, it'll drop it down by $25. So yeah, definitely worth, just even if you have a very small interest, that initial membership, getting access to those past webinars and everything is super helpful. But hopefully that helps, Terry. Again, sorry, I don't have a more definitive, this is what you should do. It just totally depends on the specifics of your situation, and each case is different, and you just unfortunately need to take a look at that and see what's going on. And then Terry mentions in here, and kudos to you, Terry, because it says that she's going to begin a title search to realign and identify her ownership in multiple mineral interests since she received inheritance in various stages in her life. And now she needs to ensure that all her ownership documents are in order, all her title work, her deeds, her leases. And so, she has listened to the Title Search podcast and is on her journey to go and do that. So congrats, Terry, and good luck. And if you get stuck or need more step-by-step instruction, I actually go through how to do that in my Mineral Management Basics course, which you can find the link to that on the website at mineralrightspodcast.com. So good luck.
Yep. Good luck, Terry. And, the questions when it comes to engineering, that's something as a mineral owner, I know my limitations. And it's not something I would know either, Terry. But one of the great things about the National Association of Royalty Owners is you get to meet folks like Matt and like others that do understand the engineering. And when you have specific questions, they can give you specific answers that may be out of your area of expertise. So it's worth its weight in gold in just that alone. All right, Matt. So our next one here is from Humberto. Humberto says, do you have any information about minimizing the amount of ad valorem taxes I have to pay the county on my oil and gas royalties? Is there a formula I should check to see if the county is calculating what they are billing me is correct? And is there a way to protest taxes like you do for home property taxes? And so, Matt, I'll knock out one or two of these. Any way to protest these? Yes, most counties do have a way to protest that. There's a standard procedure, standard form that they utilize. You can typically go to the county tax assessors and find that information. And if not, you can always call the county tax assessor's office. They're usually very helpful. Is there a way to minimize the amount of ad valorem taxes? I don't think there's any way to do that, is there, Matt? I'm not sure that it's not something you can really write off. It's not something you can reduce the amount of taxes with the county. There may be some personal tax strategies to help reduce taxes overall, but not ad valorem.
It depends on the state, I think. I've seen it in Texas. So Texas is very unique in that you pay property taxes on royalties that were paid in that tax year. So what they do is they determine the appraised value of the well. Basically, they do a reserves analysis. So they look at oil and gas reserves and what the prices are, and based on all of those things, they come up with a value. And then your proportional share of that value is what you pay in taxes. Again, it's all tied to your decimal interest in the well and what kind of royalties were paid. But the interesting thing is, because you're paying those taxes in arrears. So on a previous year, when they set the value for the next year, what they do is they use an adjustment factor on the price of oil and gas. And because commodity prices go up and down, it can be either too high or too low, depending on what the actual prices were that you were paid on. And so it's an imperfect science. You can protest it, like Justin said, and you can, if you can justify that for example, their reserves estimate on the well was wrong, that the well, initially maybe had a really high reserves estimate, maybe it stopped producing and they plugged it. Well, that's a pretty good case to go back and protest it and say, hold on a second, this thing, the future value, and this value, this well is much lower than what you have on here. Or if the price is, again, the price side of things, you have somewhat more limited ability to influence. It just sort of is what it is. In some cases, again, if prices go down significantly, then, it's sort of a bummer because you're paying on a much higher commodity price than maybe what you actually received. But there's a specific formula that the state of Texas, they've outlined as far as how they are to appraise the value on these wells. You can use that same process to go and get an alternate value and protest it, and you can be successful in doing that. Again, it just, sometimes they're off. I know I was talking to a friend of mine lately who is purchasing some interest in, I think, Lipscomb County, Texas, and the value that the tax assessor had on their tax rolls was, astronomical relative to the actual royalties that were getting paid and the value when they looked at it from that standpoint. So something was way off there. And this was, again, looking back from like an estate planning purposes. They were looking back several years ago, and that was the case back then. But so the ability to protest it or do anything about it was long gone. But certainly the cases, there are cases where mistakes are made. It's a somewhat subjective analysis that goes into establishing the value. So if you think it's way off, then it's worth digging into, and you can get help from somebody that can do the appraisal for you and come up with a alternate valuation that you can submit to the county in hopes that you can get your tax bill lowered. But just know that it does cost money to go that route. So if you have a significant interest and it's, a significant amount of money that's at stake, then it would probably make sense. But for most people, you may end up paying more to get that appraisal done or get the help to figure out what it's worth, and you would actually save in taxes. So fortunately, sometimes it's just better to write the check and stay in the good graces of the county. But yeah, definitely worth looking at and making sure that you're not paying more than you have to.
Yeah, and always worth a call, Humberto, to that county, the tax assessor. They are typically very friendly, helpful people, and especially in a case where maybe it was outlandish, they're able to look around in surrounding and maybe other owners in that particular tract, and they'd be able to spot if something was way off and help you out. But in my experience, they are some of the most friendly people. That and the county clerk staff are very friendly people and willing to help as much as they can. They like that social interaction because the books are pretty lonely. Okay, so our next one here, Matt, is from Rebecca. Rebecca says it seems that I, my sister, and 3 nephews have inherited the mineral rights for a tiny property. And she says it's 0.2178 of an acre in Carlsbad, New Mexico, the Permian area, which our deceased father reserved when he sold the property as long as 40 years ago. We weren't aware they existed. We've been contacted as his heirs by a company that is looking to obtain a lease for the rights. And we have no idea how to confirm that this is not a scam, though it's not clear what they would gain except access to our social security numbers, which they have requested in order to distribute the royalty checks. And we certainly have no idea how to evaluate their offer. Signing bonus of $750 an acre, and goes on to talk about the different royalty rates. So typical position that folks find themselves in, Matt, and especially when it's a small interest and they're throwing these big numbers at you, it can be kind of concerning. Something to keep in mind is she says this is 0.2178 of an acre, but when they're saying when they're offering you $750 an acre, when it feels like such a small property to you and sees such a big number, it can make it concerning.
Yeah, it can. And, I guess some general tips when negotiating a lease, and particularly if you have small interests, I will say that in general, even if you have large interests, you're better off negotiating for a higher royalty rate, even if that means accepting a lower lease bonus. And the reason is the value of those minerals is directly proportional to your royalty rate. So as an example, if you have a royalty rate of 1/8 of royalty, so it's a 0.125 versus a royalty rate of 0.25 or 1/5, the if you have the same interest, same tract, everything else is equal, the property that has the 25% royalty is worth twice as much as the property that's worth 1/8 with the 1/8 royalty. And the reason is because of the future royalty stream is going to be half, right, with that 1/8 royalty. So that's why, and particularly if you're only going to get, a couple $100 for signing the lease, that's immaterial for most people. It's better off. You're going to get way more, like the landman had suggested, is you could get, in that initial royalty payment could be $1,250. Well, that initial royalty payment's well going to exceed whatever lease bonus you're going to get. So maximize the royalty rate. Try to negotiate no post-production cost, so a cost-free lease. So that means they can't subtract the cost to market, to transport, things like that. Mostly that applies to natural gas, but again, that's something that if you can, try to negotiate for no post-production deductions allowed. Again, highest royalty rate. And then as far as getting an attorney, Rebecca mentions that they don't have the money to hire an attorney, but they don't need the royalties enough to warrant investing in an attorney. And particularly in this case, you could end up spending more on the attorney than you're going to get in that lease bonus payment and royalty payments as well. So in terms of determining the legitimacy of the offer, since you're going to end up kind of being on your own at this small of an interest, what I would do is first search the county clerk and recorder's website. Carlsbad, New Mexico, I believe, is in Eddy County. If it's not in Eddy, it's in Lee. I forget which one's, where that is on the county relative to the county line. But either way, you go to the search for the county records in whatever county it's located in. And this would apply to any state, anywhere. And look for who is recording oil and gas leases. So you can search those instruments, search those documents by the document type, and you just search for oil and gas lease, and then just put the date range within the last year or something like that, and see the company that you got the letter from, are they actually legitimately going out recording leases? And that'll be one indication that that is probably a legitimate offer, is if they're actually going out getting leases and recording them with the county, and that'll be a good breadcrumbs you can follow in the public records that'll determine, is this company actually valid, or are they just trying to, again, get access to your Social Security number like you mentioned. And again, the other thing too is when you get that lease offer, depending on the amount, they may want you to sign, W-9 in order for tax purposes, right? Because if you're getting paid that lease bonus and it's more than $600, they have to submit that 1099 to the IRS, and so, or to you as well. And so that's when they would ask for that Social Security number, and potentially as part of that payment process. So that doesn't seem like necessarily that it's a red flag. Although in your case, if you're only getting $160 or something like that, they may or may not need your Social Security number unless it's just company policy. So that could be something you could ask. Hey, I don't want to submit that. I want to get the lease done. It's less than $600. Can we avoid doing that? And then when you do get when the well gets drilled and you get a division order from the oil and gas company, they will ask for your Social Security number, and you will need to provide it there unless you want to pay backup withholding, which I would not recommend. That's basically where they, by law, have to withhold income tax from your royalty payments if you don't provide your Social Security number or tax ID on that W-9 form. So definitely worth doing that. And if you're worried about emailing it, you can mail it. Most companies, when they send you the division orders, they will also provide, address to send that back to, so you don't have to worry about it getting intercepted along the way in the email and somebody finding out what your Social Security number is and stealing your identity or something like that. So again, always the best advice, like we talked about, hiring an attorney, but we understand there's definitely some cases where it may not make financial sense. You do your research and try to figure out, is the company legit? Find out, others that have that have leased with the company, you could always reach out to them and ask how the experience was. And then the thing is too, is there are also other companies you can lease to. It's not just a one company game, particularly in areas like in the Permian where there's a lot of activity. There are lots of different companies that are leasing. And if you're not really happy with the offer you get from one, you can try to solicit an offer from another company or just wait, and there's more than likely you're going to get another offer, shortly after. So yeah, good luck.
Okay, Matt. So our next one here is a pretty interesting one.
So this one is from Jason, and Jason works in the state of Louisiana, and so he has just some really interesting tidbits and information about the types of calls they get from mineral and royalty owners and how he tries to help folks, and they ask, what is a lease and why aren't they receiving a royalty check after a parent dies, and just kind of the basic things about mineral ownership that you need to be aware of. But then the thing that he had some questions about is relative to the state of Louisiana's interests in unleased mineral owners, right? So this is something we've talked about on the show, that if you're unleased and you are essentially subject, to the full interest, the 8/8 interest less expenses, your proportional share. So you basically become a non-operated working interest owner after the well reaches payout. And what he's talking about is where they're seeing lessees that are reporting very high monthly operating costs that are netting out any revenue. So in other words, those wells, they're selling oil and gas, you receive revenue from that, your proportional share as a non-operated working interest owner. But then on the other hand, you also are responsible for your share of the monthly operating costs. And in an ideal world, you would have more in revenue than the costs, and in which case you would get a positive amount each month. In this case, he's saying they're, having to pay each month and they're not getting, the benefit of that. And my thought is, if that is an ongoing situation, that can certainly happen, over a couple of months. Maybe they needed to work over the well. They had some additional expenses in that month that exceeded the normal revenue, but then it should, in general, be positive. Otherwise, it could be argued that they're not following the prudent operator standard. And I don't know that Louisiana is a whole nother animal, so not an expert in Louisiana. Obviously, this is a situation where getting legal counsel to help, is important. But in general, is if they're continuing to operate it at a loss, then I think you could have an argument that lease should be released. They should plug and abandon the well. Now that means if you're a non-operated working interest owner, you're going to have to pay your proportional share of the plugging and abandoning costs, but you could sort of stop the bleeding that way. You could challenge that. And then the other thing he mentioned in here is about royalty gas values reported that are substantially reduced when you look at the state production reports, so they don't match up. Like, in other words, the volume reported to the state is lower than what is showing up on the check stub. And in that case, I would say that it, and he says the explanation that the operator says is that it's due to marketing contracts. This could be the case, but also be careful if they are processing the gas via a subsidiary company. So in other words, the same overarching company owns both the E&P, the exploration and production side that is drilling and operating the wells, and then the gas processing or midstream company, in which case they can play a little bit of, creative accounting and move expenses more so to the side of the things that is going to get deducted from your royalty check, so that they don't have to, so they can pass it on to the royalty owners. And that could be a red flag and potentially worth some legal review. And that's something that I have seen. And sometimes it is just relative to the actual gas concentration and the gas makeup. And so it's very normal. And I will say, if you have a rich gas, in other words, the gas has a lot of natural gas liquids in it, so like the propanes and butanes and things like that, the gas volume is going to shrink when they extract those out, and then they sell those as natural gas liquids or plant products. And so when you look at the royalty check, you'll have a gas volume that is going to be lower than what is reported to the state, because what is reported to the state is the wet gas that includes the natural gas liquids. But just to wrap this up, because this is it gets really complicated. at the end of the day, it's not necessarily a red flag that the gas volumes are lower that are reported to the state, as long as there is some explanation for it. And again, if you have plant products that are showing up on the royalty check, that indicates that initial gas stream, had some of that stuff. It was extracted out and sold as a liquid, as a plant product or a natural gas liquid, and then the resulting dry gas volume that is still in the sold as natural gas is going to be lower or smaller because you extracted some of those valuable hydrocarbons out. So at the end of the day, I think that's what I would look at, and if there isn't a good explanation for it, then I would certainly challenge the operator and look at perhaps getting an audit. And in your case, maybe the state has audit powers and things like that, so it might be worth doing a royalty audit to make sure that you're holding the operator accountable. So, Jason, thanks for the email. Thanks for sharing a little bit about what you do. And, thanks for helping out other mineral and royalty owners out there. So, Justin, anything else?
No, you said it. Jason, you're going up and above, and it's wonderful the questions that you're asking. And it's really interesting to see it from your perspective, because as a private mineral owner, we face a lot of the same issues, but, these are some really complex problems, and I'm sure that this is massive in scale as far as what the typical mineral owner would be looking at. And congratulations on all you've learned over your career, because you're very knowledgeable, quite obviously.
Yeah, and he said he's done presentation to narrow about those different situations you run into in the state of Louisiana. So thanks again for the offer. And he says in his email, if there's a question about Louisiana, to shoot him an email. So I'll definitely take you up on that offer, Jason, in the future if we get a Louisiana specific question. So thanks again for your help. All right, well, that wraps up this month's listener question email. Thanks again for submitting your questions and your patience in getting them answered. You can submit a question to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. And the links that we mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes, which is, as always, at mineralrightspodcast.com. So thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.